The Hawthorne family arrived at Ravenwood Forest in the late afternoon, the setting sun casting long shadows over the narrow dirt road that wound through the trees. The dense forest stretched endlessly on either side, the tall pines and oaks forming a natural tunnel that seemed to lead them deeper into an untouched world. Mark glanced at his wife, Sarah, sitting beside him in the passenger seat, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "It's even more secluded than I thought," she murmured, half to herself, as she looked out at the darkening woods. "It's perfect." Mark smiled, reaching over to give her hand a reassuring squeeze. "It's exactly what we needed. Peace, quiet, and a break from everything." In the back seat, their children, Emma and Jake, were already animated with the excitement of the unknown. 10-year-old Emma, ever the explorer, had her nose pressed against the window, eagerly scanning the forest for wildlife. Jake, 2 years younger, was engrossed in his tablet, though he occasionally looked up to ask when they'd arrive. "We're almost there, bud," Mark said, as the car rounded the final bend in the road, and the cabin came into view. It stood in a small clearing, a rustic structure of weathered wood and stone, with a sloping roof and a wraparound porch. A large stone chimney rose from one side, a promise of cozy fires on cold nights. The place looked as though it had been there for 100 years, a part of the forest rather than an intrusion. Mark parked the car, and they all got out, the cool air filled with the scent of pine and earth. Max, their golden retriever, bounded out of the back seat, his tail wagging furiously as he explored the unfamiliar surroundings. "Wow, this is amazing!" Emma exclaimed, running toward the cabin. Jake followed, his initial reluctance fading as he saw the expanse of wilderness around them. "It's perfect," Sarah repeated, this time with more confidence. "Exactly what we need." Mark nodded, but as he watched Max disappear into the trees at the edge of the clearing, he couldn't shake the slight unease that had settled in his chest. There was something about the silence here, something oppressive, as if the forest was watching them, waiting. "Let's get unpacked and settled in," Mark said, brushing off the feeling. "We've got a lot to do before it gets dark." The inside of the cabin was just as rustic as the outside, with exposed wooden beams, a large stone fireplace, and furniture that looked handmade. Sarah immediately began organizing the kitchen while the kids explored their new rooms, each choosing the one with the best view of the forest. Mark busied himself outside, bringing in the bags and checking the generator. The cabin was off the grid, relying on solar power and a backup generator for electricity. It was one of the reasons they'd chosen this place, a complete disconnect from the world. As he worked, the sun dipped lower, the light filtering through the trees in golden rays. Max reappeared, his fur matted with dirt, and Mark chuckled as he patted the dog's head. "Had your adventure for the day, huh, boy?" Max barked happily in response, then took off again, this time toward the back of the cabin. Mark shook his head, but his smile faded as he watched the dog run into the thick underbrush. That unease returned, stronger now, as if the forest itself was alive, and its ancient presence was slowly closing in on them. Inside, Sarah had lit a fire in the fireplace, the crackling flames casting a warm, comforting glow across the living room. Emma and Jake were sitting on the rug, playing with a set of old wooden blocks they'd found in one of the closets. "This place is amazing," Emma said, looking up at her father. "It's like living in a storybook." Mark forced a smile. "Yeah, it really is." He joined them by the fire, the warmth easing the tension in his shoulders. The family sat together, talking and laughing as they settled into their new home. But as the last light of day faded and the forest outside was swallowed by the night, Mark couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. Later, after dinner, Mark stepped outside to call for Max. The night air was cool and crisp, the sky above a deep, velvety black scattered with stars. But the forest was silent, unnaturally so, and Max was nowhere to be seen. He called again, his voice carrying through the trees, but there was no answering bark, no rustle of leaves to indicate the dog's return. "Where is he?" Sarah asked from the doorway, her arms crossed against the chill. "He never stays out this late." "I don't know," Mark replied, his voice tinged with worry. "He's probably just exploring. He'll come back." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Something was wrong. The silence of the forest was oppressive, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Mark stepped off the porch and walked toward the tree line, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Max!" he called again, louder this time. He was met with nothing but silence. He strained to listen, and then, just on the edge of hearing, there was a rustle, something moving quickly through the underbrush. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he swung the flashlight around, but the beam revealed only trees and shadows. "Mark, come inside," Sarah called from the porch, her voice trembling. "It's getting late." Reluctantly, Mark turned back to the cabin, but as he did, he caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye, a dark shape, tall and gaunt, slipping silently between the trees. He whipped around, the flashlight beam swinging wildly, but whatever he'd seen was gone. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. "See what?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "I don't know. I thought—" Mark shook his head. "It's nothing. Let's go inside." But even as they locked the door and settled in for the night, the image of that dark figure stayed with him. It was only the first night in the cabin, and already the forest was revealing its secrets. Mark lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, listening to the silence, the sound of his own breathing, unnaturally loud in the stillness. As he drifted off to sleep, his last thought was of Max, still out there in the darkness, and of the shadowy figure he was certain he'd seen. The unease that had gripped him all day now felt like a warning, a premonition of something terrible that was coming. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, the stalkers watched, their gaunt forms blending seamlessly with the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, Mark woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the cabin, a deceptive calm that belied the unease festering in his mind. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the remnants of a restless night, his thoughts immediately going to Max. The dog hadn't returned, and Mark's concern had only deepened as the hours ticked by in darkness. After a quick breakfast, he decided to search for Max more thoroughly. Emma and Jake wanted to come along, but Mark insisted they stay with Sarah. He didn't want them to see anything that might worry them, or worse, something that would confirm his own growing fears. "Be careful, okay?" Sarah said as she handed him a thermos of coffee and a small pack with essentials. She hadn't slept well either, her eyes shadowed with worry. "I will," Mark promised, giving her a reassuring smile he didn't quite feel. He kissed her and then headed out, the morning sun casting long, slender shadows through the trees. The forest was dense, the towering pines and oaks creating a canopy that blocked much of the light. The path he took was faint, a thin trail leading deeper into the woods, one he hoped would bring him to Max. With each step, the sense of being watched grew stronger, as if the forest itself was alive, its unseen eyes tracking his every move. "Max!" Mark called out, his voice echoing through the trees. He paused, straining to hear any response, but there was nothing, only the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. He continued walking, pushing deeper into the forest, the underbrush thickening around him. After about an hour, he found the first sign, a patch of disturbed earth where something large had moved through. Nearby, he spotted Max's paw prints, partially obscured by the tracks of something else, something much larger. His heart pounded as he crouched down to examine them, his mind racing. The tracks were unlike anything he had seen before, deep indentations in the soil with elongated toes and sharp, claw-like marks. He followed the trail, his unease growing with every step. The deeper he went, the more he noticed how the forest had changed. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisted and gnarled, the undergrowth thick with brambles. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy here, casting everything in a dim, greenish hue. Then he saw it. Max's collar, lying discarded on the forest floor. It was covered in that same sticky residue he'd noticed the night before. Mark picked it up, the substance clinging to his fingers, cold and slimy. The sight of the collar sent a chill down his spine. Something had taken Max. Something that wasn't an animal. At least not any kind he was familiar with. As Mark straightened, his instincts screamed at him that he was not alone. He spun around, scanning the trees, his breath catching in his throat. At first, there was nothing, just the silent forest, still and unmoving. But then, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw them. Dark, elongated figures standing among the trees, their bodies blending seamlessly with the shadows. The figures were tall and gaunt, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces hidden in the darkness. They stood perfectly still, watching him with a predatory stillness that made Mark's blood run cold. He tried to count them, but the more he looked, the more figures seemed to appear, slipping silently between the trees, always just out of clear sight. Fear surged through him, primal and overwhelming. He wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of the cabin, but his legs felt like lead, his body frozen by the sheer terror of what he was seeing. These weren't people. They were something else entirely, something that didn't belong in the natural world. Summoning every ounce of willpower, Mark forced himself to move, to slowly back away from the creatures. He kept his eyes on them, not daring to turn his back, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The figures didn't move, but he could feel their eyes on him, watching his every step. When he finally reached the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood, he turned and bolted, running as fast as he could. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins as he sprinted towards safety. The trees blurred around him, and the forest seemed to close in, the shadows lengthening, reaching for him. He burst out of the woods and into the clearing, stumbling up the porch steps. Sarah was there, standing by the door, her eyes wide with worry. "Mark, what happened? Where's Max?" she asked, but the look on his face stopped her cold. "Get inside, now," Mark ordered, his voice rough with fear. He practically shoved her through the door, slamming it shut behind them. The children, sensing the tension, looked up from their games, their faces mirroring the fear in their parents' eyes. "What's wrong, Dad?" Jake asked, his voice small. Mark didn't answer immediately. He went to the window, peering out into the forest. The figures were gone, but the sense of being watched remained, a constant, oppressive presence that weighed heavily on him. "Lock all the doors and windows," he finally said, turning to Sarah. "We're not safe here." Sarah's face paled, but she didn't argue. She moved quickly, securing the cabin as best she could, while Mark did the same. The children watched them, their earlier excitement replaced by a growing unease. "Dad, what did you see?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Mark hesitated, unsure how much to tell them. He didn't want to scare them more than they already were, but he also knew they needed to understand the danger. "There's something in the woods," he said, his voice low. "Something that's been watching us. I don't know what it is, but it's dangerous. We need to stay inside and stay quiet." The words hung in the air, a heavy silence falling over the cabin as the implications sank in. They were trapped, surrounded by something they didn't understand, something that was hunting them. As night fell, the cabin grew darker, the only light coming from the fire burning low in the hearth. The family huddled together, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside setting their nerves on edge. Mark sat by the window, staring out into the blackness of the forest. The figures were out there. He knew it, just beyond the tree line, waiting for the right moment to strike. He could almost feel their eyes on him, could almost hear the faintest of whispers carried on the wind. Then, just as the last light of day disappeared, he saw them again. Dark shapes moving between the trees, their gaunt forms barely visible against the shadows. They were closer now, circling the cabin, their movements slow and deliberate, as if testing the boundaries, probing for weaknesses. Mark's grip tightened on the flashlight in his hand, his knuckles white. He knew they couldn't stay in the cabin forever, that eventually the creatures would find a way in. They needed a plan, something to keep the stalkers at bay, but his mind was blank, his thoughts clouded by fear. "We need to think of something," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't just sit here and wait." Mark nodded, though his eyes never left the window. He knew she was right, but the sense of helplessness was overwhelming. Whatever these creatures were, they were beyond anything he'd ever faced, something out of a nightmare brought to life. As the night dragged on, the tension in the cabin became unbearable. The creatures outside made no sound, no indication of their presence other than the occasional glimpse of a dark figure slipping between the trees. But Mark knew they were there, watching, waiting. And as he sat there trying to think of a way out, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing a game, a deadly game in which the family was the prey and the stalkers were the hunters. The first whispers began just after midnight, a low, guttural sound that seemed to seep through the walls of the cabin. It was a language Mark didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably sinister, a sound that sent chills down his spine. Sarah clutched his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What is that?" "I don't know," Mark replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But whatever it is, it's getting closer." The whispers grew louder, the words unintelligible but filled with malice. The stalkers were toying with them, testing their resolve, waiting for the fear to drive them into making a mistake. But Mark was determined not to give in, not to let these creatures win. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to protect his family, to keep them safe from whatever was out there in the darkness. He just hoped he could figure it out before it was too late. The night seemed to stretch on forever. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension, every creak of the old wooden floors making the family jump. Mark had spent hours staring out the window, watching the shadows dance just beyond the tree line. The forest stalkers were still out there, waiting, biding their time. He knew that much, but what he didn't know was how long they could hold out before the creatures made their move. Sarah had finally convinced Emma and Jake to try to sleep, though they huddled together on the couch, the firelight casting flickering shadows on their pale, frightened faces. Mark couldn't rest, couldn't sit idle while these creatures circled their home. He needed answers. Something, anything, that could help them survive. Mark's thoughts kept returning to the old journal he had found in the attic earlier that day. It had been buried beneath a pile of dusty blankets, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. At the time, he had dismissed it as just another forgotten relic of the cabin's past. But now, with danger lurking outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that the journal might hold some clue to what they were facing. He stood up, his knees stiff from hours of sitting. Sarah looked up at him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and fear. "I'm going to check the attic again," he said quietly. "I found something up there earlier, a journal. Maybe it has some information about what's out there." Sarah nodded, though she looked reluctant to let him out of her sight. "Be careful," she whispered, glancing nervously at the dark corners of the room. Mark gave her a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder before heading toward the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, the sound eerily loud in the stillness of the night. He reached the top and hesitated for a moment before pushing open the attic door. The air up here was colder, tinged with the musty smell of old wood and dust. The weak beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the scattered remnants of the cabin's history, old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and a thick layer of dust coating everything. The journal lay where he had left it, atop a wooden chest in the far corner of the attic. Mark crossed the room and picked up the journal, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat but faded, the ink smudged in places where age had taken its toll. The name written on the first page sent a shiver down his spine. Harold Granger. He remembered that name from the stories the locals had told him in town. Harold Granger had been the cabin's previous owner, a reclusive man who had lived alone in the forest for years before disappearing without a trace. The villagers spoke of him in hushed tones, suggesting that he had gone mad from the isolation, or worse, had encountered something in the forest that drove him to insanity. Mark turned the pages slowly, reading the entries that detailed Harold's life in the cabin. At first, the journal seemed ordinary, filled with mundane observations about the weather, the wildlife, and the challenges of living so far from civilization. But as Mark read on, The tone of the entries began to change, becoming more erratic, more desperate. June 3rd. There's something in the woods. I've seen them. Tall, dark figures, always just out of sight. They watch me, follow me. I can feel their eyes on me even when I can't see them. I don't know what they are, but they're not human. June 10th. The whispers started last night, low guttural sounds that echo through the trees. I can't understand the words, but I know they're speaking to me. They're trying to drive me mad. I've barricaded the windows, but it doesn't matter. They're out there and they're coming for me. Mark's heart raced as he read Harold's words. The description of the creatures matched what he had seen, what they had all experienced. The forest stalkers were real, and they had been terrorizing people long before Mark and his family arrived. He turned another page, his breath catching as he read the next entry. June 15th. I found an old book in the cellar, something the original builders left behind. It's filled with strange symbols and rituals, ways to keep the creatures at bay. Fire seems to be the key. They fear it, avoid it. I've set up torches around the cabin, but I'm not sure it's enough. There's something more, something the book doesn't explain. A way to banish them for good. I need to find it. Mark's mind raced as he processed the information. The idea that fire could keep the creatures away made sense, but Harold had hinted at something more, something in the cellar, a book that might hold the answers they needed. He felt a surge of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this nightmare. He flipped through the remaining pages, but the entries grew more disjointed, as though Harold's sanity had begun to unravel. The last entry was dated June 20th, and it was little more than a scrawl. They're inside. I can't keep them out. The book, it's the only way, but they're too close. If anyone finds this, know that you're not alone. They're always watching. Always. The final words sent a chill down Mark's spine. The book Harold mentioned. Was it still in the cellar? Was there still time to find it? To use it? He had to try. He closed the journal and tucked it under his arm, then made his way back down to the main floor. Sarah was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes wide with concern. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Harold Granger's journal," Mark replied, his voice low. "He wrote about the creatures, the forest stalkers. He mentioned a book, something he found in the cellar. He thought it might hold the key to getting rid of them." "A book?" Sarah asked, glancing nervously toward the cellar door. "Do you think it's still there?" "I don't know," Mark admitted, "but we have to find out. It might be our only chance." Sarah nodded, though her fear was evident. "Let's go." Together they approached the door to the cellar. It creaked open with an ominous groan, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. Mark's flashlight barely penetrated the blackness below, but he could see enough to make out the rough stone walls and the wooden beams that held up the ceiling. "Stay close," Mark whispered, and they began their descent. The air grew colder as they reached the bottom, the smell of damp earth and mildew thick in the air. Mark's flashlight beams swept across the room, revealing rows of shelves filled with dusty jars and boxes, remnants of a life long forgotten. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing to a small, worn book lying on a shelf in the corner. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with age, but the strange symbols on the front were unmistakable. This was the book Harold had mentioned. Mark carefully picked it up, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it to the first page. The text was written in a language he didn't recognize, filled with intricate symbols and diagrams. But as he flipped through the pages, he found something that gave him hope. A detailed illustration of a ritual, one that involved fire, symbols, and certain herbs that could be used to ward off the creatures. "This is it," Mark said, his voice filled with determination. "This is how we can keep them away. We just need to follow the instructions." Sarah nodded, her fear replaced by a fierce resolve. "We'll do whatever it takes." Mark quickly scanned the ingredients listed in the book, relieved to find that they had most of what they needed on hand. Candles, matches, and even some dried herbs Sarah had brought along for cooking. They gathered everything and began setting up the ritual in the living room, their movements quick and deliberate. As they worked, the whispers outside grew louder, more insistent, as if the creatures knew what they were doing and were trying to stop them. But Mark refused to let fear control him. He would protect his family, no matter the cost. Once everything was in place, Mark and Sarah stood back, the air thick with the scent of burning herbs and smoke. Mark lit the final candle, and as the flame flickered to life, a strange energy seemed to pulse through the room. The whispers outside grew louder, almost frantic, and for a moment Mark wondered if the ritual would work. But then, as the flames of the candles grew brighter, the whispers began to fade until all that was left was silence. The change was immediate. The oppressive feeling that had weighed on them all night lifted, and Mark felt as if the cabin itself had taken a breath of relief. The stalkers were still out there. He could feel their presence, but they were no longer closing in. The ritual had worked. The creatures were being held at bay. "We did it," Sarah whispered, tears of relief in her eyes. Mark nodded, though his heart was still heavy. This was only a temporary solution, a way to buy them time. They couldn't stay here forever, and the stalkers wouldn't wait forever. "We'll make it through the night," Mark said, his voice steady. "And tomorrow, we'll figure out how to get out of here." And somewhere out in the darkness, the stalkers waited, watching, their gaunt forms hidden among the trees, their hunger growing with each passing moment. The first rays of dawn had barely begun to pierce the thick canopy of the forest when Mark Hawthorne realized that time was running out. The fragile peace they had bought with Harold Granger's ritual was unraveling. He could feel it in the air, a palpable tension that coiled around the cabin like a tightening noose. The stalkers were relentless, cunning, and worse, they were patient. Mark knew that whatever reprieve the ritual had granted them would soon end. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the room as the family huddled together, exhausted but alert. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside sent shivers down their spines. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a prison. Sarah sat close to Emma and Jake, holding them tightly as if her very grip could shield them from the terror lurking outside. The children were silent, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with fear. They had been so brave, but Mark knew they couldn't endure this much longer. "We can't stay here," Mark finally said, his voice rough from the tension. He glanced at Sarah, who met his gaze with an understanding that sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through him. They're just waiting for us to make a mistake, and we can't give them that chance. Sarah nodded, her grip on the children tightening. So what do? We can't fight them, Mark. We don't even know what they are. We don't have to fight them, Mark replied, his mind racing. We just need to get out of this forest. If we can make it to the main road, someone will find us. The stalkers are tied to the woods. If we leave, they can't follow. But the woods are their territory, Sarah said, her voice trembling. They know it better than we do. How can we escape if they're hunting us? Mark's jaw tightened, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had no clear plan, no guarantees, but he couldn't let fear paralyze him. They had survived the night. Now they had to survive the day. He thought of Harold's journal, of the pages he had read over and over in the last few hours. The old man had nearly succumbed to madness, but even in his despair, Harold had found a way to keep the creatures at bay. Now it was up to Mark to do the same. We need to use everything we've got, Mark said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The fire, the noise, it's the only thing that's kept them from coming inside so far. We'll light torches, use whatever we can find to make noise, and keep them off us while we head for the road. We don't stop, no matter what. We stick together, and we move fast. Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She glanced at Emma and Jake, who clung to her, their small faces etched with terror. Do you think we can make it? We have to, Mark replied, the words more for himself than for them. We don't have a choice. The family moved quickly, gathering what few supplies they could carry, matches, candles, the last of the food and water. Mark fashioned makeshift torches from chair legs and rags soaked in lamp oil, the flickering flames offering a small comfort in the overwhelming darkness. When everything was ready, they stood by the door, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a physical force. Outside, the forest was eerily quiet, the thick fog that had rolled in during the night still clinging to the trees, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. Stay close, he said, his voice low but steady. No matter what happens, we stay together. I lead. Sarah, you stay in the middle with the kids. If something happens to me... He cut himself off, unable to finish the thought. Just keep moving. Don't look back. Sarah nodded, her eyes brimming with fear and determination. We'll make it, Mark. We have to. Mark turned the handle and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The cold, damp air hit him like a wall, carrying with it the earthy scent of the forest and something else, something rancid like decaying leaves and wet fur. They stepped outside, the fog immediately closing in around them, swallowing the cabin behind a wall of gray. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Mark led the way, holding the torch high, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the ground. Behind him, he could hear the steady footsteps of Sarah and the children, their breathing quick and shallow. For a moment, it seemed as though they might have a chance. The forest was quiet, the stalkers nowhere in sight. But Mark knew better than to trust the silence. The creatures were out there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first sign of movement came from the corner of his eye, a dark shape flitting between the trees, too fast and too silent to be anything human. Mark tightened his grip on the torch, his heart pounding in his chest. "Keep moving," he whispered, though his voice felt like a scream in the oppressive silence. The path ahead was barely visible through the fog, but Mark pushed forward, his every instinct screaming at him to run. The trees seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, darker. And then he saw them, the stalkers, slipping through the mist, their gaunt forms almost blending with the gray, their faces hidden in shadow. They were closer now, more aggressive, their movements quick and deliberate. Mark realized with a sickening dread that they were being herded, driven in a specific direction. The stalkers were cutting off their escape, pushing them deeper into the forest where the fog was thickest. "No!" Mark shouted, turning sharply to the right, toward where he knew the main road lay. "This way." They broke into a run, the fog swirling around them as they crashed through the underbrush. The torches flickered wildly, casting erratic beams of light that barely cut through the darkness. Mark could hear the stalkers moving around them, closing in, their presence a constant, suffocating pressure. "Faster," he urged, his voice strained with fear. "Don't stop." But the forest was against them. The ground grew uneven, roots and rocks jutting up to trip them, branches clawing at their clothes and faces. The fog thickened, making it harder to see, harder to breathe. Then, without warning, one of the stalkers lunged out of the mist, its long, spindly arms reaching for Sarah. She screamed, stumbling back, the torch slipping from her grasp. Mark turned just in time to see the creature, its hollow eyes locked onto Sarah, its mouth opening in a grotesque, silent snarl. Without thinking, he swung his torch at the creature, the flames catching its arm. The stalker recoiled, retreating into the shadows, but Mark knew it was only a temporary victory. "They're getting closer!" Jake cried, his voice high with panic. Mark grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her to her feet. "We're almost there. Just keep running." But the forest was relentless. More stalkers emerged from the mist, their forms barely visible but terrifyingly real. They moved with unnatural speed, darting between the trees, their gaunt faces twisted with hunger. The family ran faster, driven by pure adrenaline, but the stalkers were everywhere, closing in from all sides. Mark's mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to protect his family. The road was close. He could feel it, but they wouldn't make it at this pace. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and then through the fog Mark saw a flicker of light. Headlights, faint but unmistakable, cutting through the gray. The road was just ahead, but they needed to reach it before the stalkers caught them. "Go!" Mark shouted, pushing Sarah and the children ahead. "Run for the road. Don't look back." He turned to face the stalkers, holding his torch high, the flames his only defense against the advancing creatures. The stalkers hesitated, their hollow eyes fixed on the fire, but Mark knew they wouldn't stay back for long. "Mark, come on!" Sarah screamed from the edge of the fog, her voice filled with desperation. Mark backed away slowly, keeping the torch between him and the stalkers. He could hear the roar of the approaching vehicle, the sound of salvation just within reach. But the stalkers weren't finished. They lunged at him, a final, frenzied attack. Mark swung the torch wildly, the flames a blur of light and heat. The creatures shrieked, their cries piercing the night as they recoiled from the fire. But there were too many, and they were closing in too fast. "Mark!" Sarah's voice was closer now, desperate. "Please!" Mark turned and ran, the torch still blazing in his hand. He broke through the last of the underbrush, stumbling onto the narrow road just as a truck screeched to a halt, its headlights blinding in the mist. "Get in!" the driver shouted, his voice barely audible over the pounding of Mark's heart. Mark didn't hesitate. He threw open the door, shoving Sarah and the children inside before climbing in himself. The stalkers were right behind them, their gaunt forms materializing out of the fog, their eyes filled with a malevolent hunger. "Drive!" Mark yelled, slamming the door shut, just as the stalkers reached the truck. The driver floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as the truck sped down the road, leaving the creatures behind in a swirl of mist and darkness. Mark looked back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but the stalkers were gone, swallowed by the fog. For a long moment, the only sound was the roar of the engine and the labored breathing of the family huddled in the truck. The forest receded behind them, the trees giving way to open road and the first light of dawn. Mark collapsed against the seat, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. They had made it. Somehow, against all odds, they had survived. But the memory of the stalkers, their hollow eyes and relentless pursuit, would haunt him forever. "Are you all right?" the driver asked, his voice filled with concern. Mark nodded, though he wasn't sure how to answer that question. "We're alive," he said, his voice hoarse. "That's what matters." Sarah reached over and took his hand, her grip tight. "We made it," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. "We're safe." Mark squeezed her hand, but he knew better. The stalkers were still out there, hidden in the depths of the forest, waiting for their next prey. The terror they had endured was not something that would easily fade. The memory of those gaunt figures, those hollow eyes, would stay with them, a permanent scar on their souls. As the truck drove on, carrying them away from the forest and back to the safety of the world they had known before, Mark couldn't help but glance back one last time. The road behind them was empty, the fog dissipating in the early morning light. But he knew the truth. The stalkers were still out there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. And the next time someone ventured too deep into Ravenwood Forest, they would be there, ready to strike. The forest would always hold its secrets, and the Hawthorne family would carry the weight of those secrets with them for the rest of their lives. They had escaped, but they would never truly be free. The stalkers would see to that. And somewhere, deep within the woods, the creatures watched as the truck disappeared into the distance, their gaunt forms blending seamlessly with the shadows, their hunger far from sated. The forest was theirs, and it would never let them go.